Hey guys, Julian. I just wanted to record a quick video discussing the general election results from last week. Boris Johnson won a smashing majority, as we all saw. Everybody had hoped otherwise, but this is where we are now. And what I'd like to discuss is where I think things went wrong, how I think things could have gone better, and what's likely to happen now and what people should possibly do. So just full disclosure, not everybody knows this as I kept this under wraps, but I've spent the last year working with Gina Miller on her Brexit campaign, so I did have some engagement in what was happening before this election. Obviously, my own work in Brussels and across Europe was separate to this, but just so everybody knows, this is where I'm coming from and this is what I've been doing for the past year. But to begin with, this election was called in a very strange manner where effectively Joe Swinson's Lib Dems and Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party gave Boris Johnson an election that he wanted, despite the fact that they had a chance to just keep inflicting defeat after defeat after defeat with him in votes in Parliament on topics that he wanted. And this was possible. Well, this was clearly not the smartest idea because it's how we ended up where we are now. And rather than keeping him at a very, very bad position, they decided to give him a chance to get out. And with Boris Johnson being a risk taker, this is where we are now. So this wasn't the best idea, and this was the beginning of a series of strategic mistakes that were engaged in by Joe Swinson in particular, who decided that when this election was launched, she was going to run it as a presidential campaign under the impression that she was going to win a majority and had a chance of becoming prime minister. Now, I'm not really sure what polling led to this decision. I understand from what we've seen past this election date that people advised her against it, including Vince Cable, I believe, and Tim Farron. But it looked like she did this in a moment of hubris after having done quite well during the European elections, which was in large part down to tactical voting for the Lib Dems, as they were at the time the only out and out Remain party there was, and was a very clear choice, as well as the different electoral system through the Dion system and these issues here. Another problem that I can see is that there was a lot of ferocious infighting happening between the Lib Dems, the Remain alliance overall, and the Labour Party, which was not helped by the behaviour of some on social media and was driven in some ways by a sort of forced ignorance of what was actually happening. So, for example, I had a lot of run-ins with Lib Dem voters or Remainers who, for some reason, decided that they wanted to campaign wholeheartedly against Labour because they thought they could beat Labour, and they were under the impression that Labour was pro Brexit. Now, the issue with this point of view is that it wasn't based in reality. I mean, I understand that people had a lot of trouble looking into what was happening with Labour sitting on the fence, as many people put it, and even I was quite against Labour for a long while because I didn't understand why they thought it beneficial to fight for both Leave voters and Remain voters when, if what we were seeing was true, that Remainers were more, there was more Remainers across the UK. However, the problem is that eventually people started to realise that there was a long game at play, that the Labour Party were trying their best to make things work, especially considering their northern heartlands, which they have now lost due to this strategy, so obviously it didn't work. But there was a lot of forced ignorance regarding the Labour Party's position during this election, despite the fact that in their manifesto they said outright, we're going to go for a second referendum, which is what everybody seems to have wanted since 2016, but not enough to vote for Jeremy Corbyn for a number of reasons. There were also, and this comes down partly to the bizarre and self-destructive social media bubbles that we've seen pop up since the referendum. There was also this big issue where if you weren't part of the Remain club or you weren't part of the Leave club and you tried to have a say in the situation, it tended to go quite badly. You tend to face a certain amount of hostility, frequently being insulted, and in general being treated in a way that was just not pleasant overall. Now, obviously, emotions have been higher for the past 3 years. People have felt a lot of loss, people have felt a lot of grief, but it wasn't conducive to this election and it caused a lot of problems. Another major issue that caused and prevented any sensible tactical voting, from what I've seen, was the fact that we went from having one major tactical voting campaign in 2017, led by Gina Miller when she was still a member of Best for Britain before leaving, and then having a few during the European elections, of which I believe Remain United's tactical voting campaign was the most effective and the most on target, despite the fact that many people were actively working against the campaign and outright insulting it and misleading people about what the campaign was doing. To this time, we had 5 or 6, I believe, including tactical voting campaign compare websites, which got really bizarre because then this simply just confused everybody about what was happening. And in some cases, you'd have 2 people saying Labour was the best choice. You have 2 websites saying you had Lib Dems as the best choice, and then you had a 5th website saying that the website was too close to the election area was too close to call. And this is in part why this went so badly, because people weren't able to effectively tactically vote, and there was a lot of confusion. For example, there were people, and I could see this on social media, I could see this on multiple channels, where people were actively working against what polling was saying, and what polling was saying was then also being manipulated by some parties like the Lib Dems, who famously put out some doctored and incorrect polls and charts which became very bizarre and was a part of the whole Lib Dem strategy that didn't quite work. But effectively, you had 5 tactical voting campaigns recommending 5 different things based on sometimes 5 different polls, and it hamstrung the whole operation. If it had been similar to the European elections, where it was maybe 3 tactical voting campaigns, then it might have been doable. But when you split the vote that many times, and it was often based on what post-referendum group you were most closely aligned with, which party they were often closest to, who had the most influence over them, these types of things, then it wasn't possible for this to possibly work. Whereas, for example, on the Leave side of things, you had just one shot. You voted for the Conservatives for the most part. The Brexit Party stood down in the majority of seats that the Conservative Party held, and even in the seats that they didn't hold, people already knew you need to vote Conservative if you want to have Brexit. If you want to stop this, you vote Conservative Party. That was simple. That was simply how the situation broke down. And it's, again, going back to the Lib Dems campaign behaviour and the Labour Party's campaign behaviour as well. If they had been more sensible, if they had actually taken the situation seriously and sat down and plotted out which seats they were doing worst in, which seats they were third place in, maybe 2 weeks out, maybe 1 week out even, and just came to a decision and said, okay, we're not likely to win this seat. Let's endorse the other candidate. Let's let them go first, and let's throw our support behind them and try to stop a Conservative leave. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. Throughout the campaign, Labour and Lib Dems were taking chunks out of each other, and their supporters were doing similarly and hamstringing each other in a similar way, which made, admittedly, by the time we got to the last week of the election, it was almost impossible for these parties to work together because there was so much bad blood. They were so closely matched in some places that they always wanted to try their shots. And of course, you had situations where, for example, Chuka Amuna may have benefited from a Labour tactical vote, but because of the bad blood with his departure, it wasn't possible. Same thing with Labour and Sam Gyimah. They wouldn't have been able to support a former Tory because, I mean, obviously there were fears that if it didn't go well, he may just rejoin the Tories. He may not actually stay with the Lib Dems. There was a lot of considerations that were going into these, and sadly, it just broke down the way it did. Now, I could possibly make an hour-long video discussing where things went wrong, and if people were interested in that, I'd be happy to. I mean, I have a number of points that I could bring up, such as the fact that Boris Johnson ran almost exactly the same kind of campaign Theresa May did, but through being a man, he didn't necessarily have to deal with the same kind of what we can only assume is sexism that Theresa May did, which led to her being treated abhorrently by even her own MPs. Likewise, there's the issues of how did impressions of the European Union, how things had gone recently, for better or worse, affected and made Boris Johnson look a lot stronger than he actually was. For example, if the withdrawal agreement was not a great deal for Boris Johnson, it was basically Theresa May's deal with one or two tiny amendments that played well for the electorate, but in reality it wasn't very strong at all. However, what happens now, this is the big question, and this is where things get interesting, because now we're going to have another vote on the withdrawal agreement, which is likely to pass if we can assume that the majority of Conservatives will vote for it even, but it would effectively be a confidence vote in Boris Johnson. And with the ERG Spartans now being outnumbered and no longer having a dominant vote, as well as the DUP being weakened, I mean, we can assume it's going to go through, and it's going to go through with a decent majority. However, we're now in a position as well where it's going to move on to the negotiations surrounding the future relationship between the UK and the EU, which, with Boris Johnson's recent decision to enshrine the Brexit date in law and apparently to legislate making any extension illegal, I've seen, we can expect that Boris Johnson is going to be in as weak a position negotiating with the EU as Theresa May was when she did exactly the same thing, negotiating the withdrawal agreement. The issue now is that the European Union is a trade superpower. I mean, if the figures aren't wrong, then the EU is the biggest trading power in Europe, and there's a reason that you have theories such as Market Power Europe, which is Europe exploiting its market and economic policies and powers to influence other countries. And this is simply going to be a fairly lopsided negotiation with the EU, and the UK can't expect to dictate terms in the way that Boris Johnson is likely to think that he can. Regardless of the domestic politics, regardless of what's happening now, you've got member states such as France who are going to be pushing very hard on certain issues. You've got the EFTA states who are going to want to prevent the UK having terms that are too good compared to them without being a member of either the EFTA, EU, or having a close relationship. And with Boris Johnson likely to want, well, with Donald Trump's now pushing hard for a trade deal that would need to have reduced quality, reduced legislation, and a reduction in the quality that the EU demands for products entering the single market, we're likely to have a problematic situation. And the trade deal that is likely to be signed, from the indications that I have seen so far, and from the comments made by Michael Gove and Boris Johnson about a quick deal being possible, what's likely to happen is that you are going to have a trade deal that is not going to be extensive. You're going to have more than a few people who will be or more than a few sectors that are going to be missing out, and a few quite angry people when they realize how this trade deal is going to shake out. Now, I'm not going to pretend that I can predict what the trade deal is going to look like. I mean, it's possible that services will be excluded depending on how these go, but again, I don't want to look like I'm predicting anything that nobody can really predict it right now. However, the negotiation is going to be tough. It's not going to be as easy as people like Boris Johnson think, and it's not going to be as simple as people have assumed this election. And in many cases, it would have likely been better to seek an extension in January, have a Corbyn-led government renegotiate the withdrawal agreement and some prior stipulations for the future agreement, rather than going down the road that we're going now. But the choices have been made. We're where we are. That's what's happening. In terms of what's going to happen or what should happen next in the UK, people should be very wary of the attempts at deregulation that are going to be made, and the fact that Conservatives are already reneging on certain promises they made during the election. I think I've seen some things on workers' rights are going to be rolled back, and this is going to be a very tense and terse situation, and this is where ordinary people need to start sticking together and working together. Now, you're going to have a lot of community groups that are going to be needing help. You're going to have a lot of food banks that are going to need donations. You're going to have a lot of civil rights groups that are going to be campaigning heavily to maintain rights that already exist and to prevent a loss of rights that is likely post-Brexit. I have a few colleagues who are going to be launching their own, groups to sort of help people out of need. And I'll be putting some links in the description of this video for these groups. But what people should be doing now is they should be working together. They should be looking to shore up their local communities and make sure that their neighbors and their friends and their families and their areas are in a good place, and making sure that the people who need support the most are going to get the support. So you'll need to start, if you have time, I'd suggest volunteer for charities, volunteer for groups that are looking for assistance. And if you have an idea, bring it up with someone who you think could help you actually enact this idea. It can be something as simple as a friend of mine is setting up a system for people to seek pro bono advice, to seek advice on any issues that may arise. Or if you are, for example, you're an EU citizen and you're looking for a way to support your fellow EU citizens, look at the group Settled, look at the 3 million, try and give them your support, because these are the people who are the most vulnerable, especially with things changing as quickly as they're likely to after Brexit. They will need your help. And I think a final thing that I'd like to add as well is I've noticed already that people are repeating the same mistakes from after the referendum as that led us to the situation now, where people are running before they can walk. You're seeing a lot of analysis that's popped up over the weekend in what I can only describe as having been an emotional weekend, where a lot of us felt a bit lost and we were very disappointed by the results. And a lot of people are coming up with plans and new crowdfunders and new, legal actions that could help. However, the important thing right now is to take our time and correctly analyze the situation and look at what's happening, because we can't just run ahead like we did after the referendum and make similar mistakes and keep putting ourselves into a position where people like Boris Johnson can win elections that they should have lost after lying through their teeth. There's a few initiatives that I disagree with. I mean, I'll make videos on those as well. But primarily it's things such as this associative citizenship for British citizens after Brexit, which would confer British citizens freedom of movement, despite the fact that freedom of movement is attached to being a member state national. These kind of movements aren't necessarily what's needed right now. What we need is people to be focusing on what people need immediately, the support they need, because having freedom of movement is going to benefit certain people. It's going to benefit people like myself who travel around Europe. It's going to benefit people like Joe Morn, who's running who's planning on launching a legal action or a court case to decide if UK citizens can keep EU citizenship. And I don't think these are the right ways to go about them. These aren't surefire ways of protecting the people that need the help the most. What people should be focusing on is looking at avenues for how we can stop the degradation of rights in the UK, not looking towards how can the more privileged amongst us maintain EU citizenship. Because let's be honest, it's highly unlikely. It's another case of exceptionism, I think, because I mean there's a certain mentality that goes behind thinking you can just have the perks of being an EU citizen without actually being in the EU, and trying to avoid the trouble that third country nationals have to go through if they want to become EU citizens. For example, in France or even the UK, right now it's quite difficult to gain nationality. In many countries it is, and it's, in my opinion, is slightly egocentric to pursue these policies. However, I'm cutting it off here because we've just reached 20 minutes. If anybody has any questions or anything they'd like me to go more in detail with and discuss, then please do get in touch. Comment below, send me an email, whatever. Just let me know if there's any videos you'd like me to make. I have a few questions that I'd set up previously that some people sent through that I will be trying to answer over the next couple of days. But for now, thanks for listening. If you want to see more of this, please do let me know, subscribe, like the video, and yeah, thank you very much.